The Pecos was dying quiet when the scream cut it open. It wasn't the call of a coyote, nor the panic of a calf. This sound was thin and human, raw enough to make the cottonwoods shiver along the bend. Caleb Hart stopped mid-stride, one boot planted in brittle grass, the other on dust hard as kiln-fired clay. The air smelled of the river, damp earth under the dry sting of autumn wind. Another cry, shorter this time, as if the voice had already burned most of its strength. Caleb turned his head toward the low, dark line of the Pecos, where dusk's last orange smoldered behind a stack of gray cloud. His weathered hand found the fence rail without looking. He moved toward the sound. The chestnut gelding stood tied at the gate, ears twitching. Caleb loosed the knot, swung up, and pressed his knees in. He didn't spur. A man learned, by 58, that rushing often meant arriving too late. The horse's hooves made a muffled thud in the grass, each step drawing him closer to the river's slow hiss. He found her in the half-light under a crooked cottonwood, knees in the reeds, bare feet sunk in mud the color of dried blood. She was young, 20s maybe, but hollowed by something more than hunger. Her hair, black as river stones after rain, clung in ropes to her cheeks. In her arms lay a bundle, shifting weakly, and from that bundle came a faint, wet whimper. Caleb dismounted slow, as if stepping into a pen with a spooked colt. She flinched when he closed the distance, but she didn't pull away when his calloused fingers eased back the blanket from the baby's face. A girl. Skin dusky and chilled, breath fluttering like a moth against glass. He set 2 fingers to her neck. Alive, barely. He felt his own breath leave on a whisper he hadn't planned. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. Psalm 91:4. The woman's dark eyes darted to him, searching for meaning, then back to the baby. He slid an arm under her shoulders, the other beneath the child, lifting both with the unthinking steadiness of a man who'd once believed he'd be doing this every day. She was lighter than she looked, as if most of her had already been spent getting this far. The gelding shifted under the sudden weight when Caleb settled them on the saddle, then started for home with Caleb walking beside, one hand on the reins, the other braced against the woman's back. The ranch sat low between 2 hills, timber walls silvered by years of wind, roof lines sagging toward the middle like an old horse in winter. No smoke yet. He'd banked the fire that morning before heading out. The front porch creaked under his boots as he carried them inside. The heat came fast once he'd coaxed the embers into flame. He set her on a chair near the hearth, found the kettle, and poured warm water into a basin. A clean rag followed. She took it with shaken hands, eyes never leaving him long enough to notice where he'd drawn the cloth from. Food? His voice came out rough from disuse. She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Beans ladled into a tin bowl. A heel of bread, dry but fresh enough. She ate in quick, uncertain bites, glancing at him between mouthfuls like she expected him to snatch it back. Outside, wind brushed the shutters with the restless touch of something looking for a way in. Inside, only the slow crackle of wood and the wet, rhythmic gulp of the child at her breast. Caleb took the rocker opposite her. The chair had been Ruth's before the winter fever. Its creak was a language he hadn't heard in years. He kept his eyes on the fire, not on her, though he could feel her gaze tracking every move. Near the far wall, half in shadow, sat the cradle he'd built long ago from pine and hope. The varnish was cracked, one rail dented from a dropped hammer. It had never held a child. Now it waited, as it had for 15 years, in the quiet patience of wood. She didn't take the room he'd offered. Caleb had stepped aside in the narrow hallway, nodding toward the small door at the end, but she only shook her head. Instead, she spread her thin blanket on the rug beside the hearth, curling around the baby as if the fire itself might try to steal her. Mika, he didn't yet know the name, fed in small bursts, then slept in uneasy twitches. Every time the child stirred, the woman's hand tightened around her, and her eyes flicked toward Caleb as though measuring the distance between them. He left her to the warmth, moving into the kitchen corner to fill the kettle. The smell of coffee began to rise, dark and bitter. He poured a mug, set it on the table, and lowered himself into the rocking chair. The wood groaned in a familiar way beneath his weight, a sound he'd lived with for years, though not in use, more like a ghost that stayed to keep count of the hours. From that chair, Ruth had once mended clothes, read aloud from the good book on cold Sundays, and leaned her head against the backrest with a smile that outlasted every word she'd said. 15 winters had passed since then, but the shape of her absence still fit the room. The woman turned toward him suddenly. "Elena," she said, her voice low and deliberate, as if offering something that could be taken back. He gave a small nod. "Caleb." Nothing more passed between them for a long while. The fire whispered in its own language. Outside, the wind shifted, pressing at the shutters in uneven breaths. Caleb sipped his coffee slowly, eyes on the glow in the hearth, while she stared at the same light from the floor. Near his boots sat a small tin box, its lid dented at the corner. He reached for it without thinking, then stopped halfway. Instead, he looked toward the shelf by the far wall, where a photograph leaned in a frame smudged with years of dust. Ruth again, caught in a rare still moment, fair hair tucked under a bonnet, holding a sprig of wildflower as though it might take flight. Beside it, folded carefully, was a knitted scarf in deep brown wool. He'd left it there for winters without an owner. The woman's gaze followed his for a moment, then dropped back to the sleeping bundle in her arms. She adjusted the blanket tighter around the baby's shoulders, her movements careful but tense, like someone holding more than one fragile thing at a time. Caleb set the coffee down and rose, crossing to the door. He stepped out onto the porch, the old planks sighing under his boots. In the dark, the hills hunched against the night wind. He lingered a moment, breathing the cold until his breath turned to mist, then went back inside. She hadn't moved. The baby's breathing had evened out into the small, soft sound of sleep. Caleb pulled the extra quilt from the cedar chest, shook it once, and draped it over them both without a word. Her eyes lifted to his, just for a second, then back down again. Later, when the fire had burned low and the room smelled faintly of smoke and coffee grounds, Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied the lines of the cradle in the corner. Time had settled into its seams. The thought came, uninvited, that the wood might not mind the weight after all these years. He didn't voice it. Some things were better left to grow in silence. Beyond the walls, the wind began to fade. In its place, the first pale hint of dawn pressed against the window glass. Out there, somewhere along the riverbank, the prints of their arrival were already blurring under dust and darkness. By the time the sun found the hills, there would be no sign of where she'd come from. But the house would remember. So would he. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. 2, maybe 3 weeks made a habit out of necessity. By the Pecos, the days came lean and square, bordered by chores and the small negotiations of sharing a roof. Caleb was up before the pail came to the hills, touching the stove to life, checking the sky's edges for weather, counting cattle in the dim, like a man running fingers over an old scar. Fences had taken a beating from wind and time. He shouldered posts, tamped earth with the heel of his boot, and strung wire that sang a low, tired note when it tightened true. From the yard he could hear the river gossiping over stone, and, sometimes, a thread of melody he couldn't place. Elena's voice carried there, soft and steady, the kind that keeps hands moving. She washed by the shallows with her skirt pinned above the ankle, sleeves rolled, Mika swaddled in a scrap of blanket close by. The tune eased in and out of the cottonwood hiss. No words he knew, only the lift and fall of something older than the track to town. When a stray dog barked far off, she paused, head turned toward the gate, then went back to her rhythm. The house found a new pattern. Every cold morning, a brown wool scarf waited on the porch rail, shaken free of dust and folded once. Elena never asked where it came from, and Caleb didn't say. He just made sure it was there before dawn. Inside, when he set his mug at the table, a second tin cup began to appear beside it, turned upside down at first, then upright, clean and ready. He didn't comment on the change. He filled both cups and slid one across the wood without scraping it. They did not look at each other long. Crossing the narrow kitchen, they kept a kind, practical orbit, passing plates, the kettle, a towel for drying. Never turning a back, never crowding a corner. It wasn't choreography so much as a truce understood by body and breath. Mika slept in the afternoons, small fists tucked under her chin, and when she complained at nothing, the rocker earned its old job back, creaking a slow line under Caleb's weight while he paced the floor with the baby against his chest. Elena watched without speaking, needle flashing in and out of a torn hem. Out by the southern fence, a top strand had loosened. Caleb rested his forearms on the post, feeling the give, and reached into the pouch for staple and hammer. The work pulled a pleasant ache through his shoulders, a surety in his palms he hadn't felt since the year Ruth planted lilacs by the stoop. He set the last staple, leaned back, and caught, at the edge of vision, the flash of a riverbird's wing. Odd how a day could feel full without a single conversation of length. When clouds shouldered in from the west one afternoon, he stowed the tools and checked the roofline for loose shingles. Elena was stringing a line between two junipers, pinching cloth with wooden pegs. Her braid hung heavy down her back, a dark rope against the wind-paled cotton of her dress. She worked fast, practical, like the weather was always 5 minutes ahead. He considered offering help, then left it. Her hands had already explained they knew what to do. At supper she tasted the beans, then reached for the salt without looking up. "Good," she said, the words small and uncomplicated. He nodded, more to the table than to her. Mika hiccuped once, startled at her own sound, and all three of them laughed, a brief, surprised thing that folded the room a little closer. Night set its shoulder to the windows earlier with each passing day. The lamp's circle of light was a country of its own in the kitchen, edges soft as wool. Caleb spread the ledger on the table some evenings, not to write, numbers could wait, but to put something steady under his hands. Elena mended a shirt cuff and then another, her needlework clean and durable. When she finished, she left the folded cloth at the end of the table and went to bank the fire. The cradle took Mika's weight for the first true nap since the river. The wood did not complain. On the third Sunday, he saddled the gelding to check the north pasture and found the gate mended without asking. The wire twist was not his, tighter and neater than he'd have bothered with. He touched it once and smiled to himself, a quick, private thing, and rode on. Later that evening, wind rattled a loose shutter. Elena set the latch and, when she turned, found Caleb closer than she expected with a small bundle of split kindling in his arms. They both paused. He shifted to leave the doorway clear. She stepped through. The space between them felt measured, respectful, and, strangest of all, safe. Before bed, he set the scarf again on the porch rail. Inside, he lifted the kettle to refill it and found the second cup already waiting, upright, shining in the lamplight. He poured, slid it across. She reached, fingers brushing the tin near his. Neither of them remarked on the warmth. It had come like weather does, seen first at the horizon, then suddenly all around. The wind carried the smell of rain that afternoon, though the sky held its color. Caleb was in the yard, oiling the hinges on the barn door, when he heard the creak of the well rope. Elena was drawing water, her braid catching what little sun broke through the clouds. She'd looped the end with a thin strip of red cloth, knotted once, tight enough to hold against years. He'd seen hair like that before, in the mining camps, in the trading posts. But here, under the dim New Mexico light, it carried something heavier. She poured the water into a bucket and caught him watching. "It's from my mother," she said simply, voice flat as a statement of weather. "She used to braid it for me. My sister, too. The last time was the day before." She stopped, eyes fixed on the rippling surface in the bucket. "Before they buried her in a ditch the settlers cut through." Caleb tightened the rag around the hinge pin, testing the swing. "Didn't cut it when you left?" he said. She shook her head once. "It's the only piece of my life that won't bleed or cry out." The silence after wasn't awkward. It felt like a bench built for two, wide enough that no one had to move closer. Caleb shut the barn door, hooked the latch, and walked to the porch. That night, with the wind nudging at the shutters, they ate by lamplight. Mika had finally settled, her small hand hooked on the edge of the quilt. Elena sat with her feet tucked under the chair, the braid now resting over her shoulder like a black rope against linen. Caleb glanced at it once, then down at his bowl. He thought of Ruth's hair, pale as straw at harvest, slipping from its pins as she leaned over the washtub. When the dishes were done, he lingered at the hearth, turning the old coffee tin in his hands. The lid was dented at one corner. The bottom held a faint rust ring from years of sitting in the same spot. Inside were three things: a gold band dulled with time, a ribbon the color of faded wheat, and a square of cloth once white. He didn't take them out, just looked, then closed the lid. She noticed, though, she pretended not to. Was she sick? "Fever," he said. His voice stayed level, but his hand slowed on the tin. "Came with the snow. Took her quick. The midwife tried to stop the bleeding after the baby came, but—" His eyes stayed on the hearth. "Didn't take." Elena's gaze fell to the table, to the steam curling from her tea. "My mother died the same way," she said, barely above the whisper of the fire. The room held still for a moment. The stove ticked as the heat settled into its seams. Outside, a horse snorted in the paddock. In the space between those sounds was a thread of understanding, thin but there. Later, when Mika stirred, Caleb rose before Elena could. He lifted the baby from the cradle, rocking her gently in the crook of one arm, the other hand steadying the back of her head. "You've got her," Elena murmured, not as a question, but as if confirming something she'd only half believed until now. By the time the baby had grown quiet again, the wind had shifted north. Caleb laid her back in the cradle and pulled the quilt to her chin. His palm rested there a moment longer than needed. When he straightened, Elena was still watching. She didn't smile, but the sharpness in her eyes had eased, just enough to let the lamplight through. He banked the fire, set the kettle, and nodded toward the second cup already waiting on the table. Neither spoke. The night didn't need it. The first frost came early that year, laying its pale breath over the yard before the sun had cleared the low ridge. Caleb had risen before light, stacked kindling in the stove, and left a pot of beans to simmer while he checked the north fence. By the time he came back, the air in the cabin carried the steady warmth of fire and the faint sweetness of wood smoke. Elena sat at the table with Mika in her lap, sewing the hem of a small dress from a strip of faded calico. She worked without looking up, the baby half dozing against her chest. Caleb hung his coat on the peg, then reached for the worn Bible on the shelf. Its spine had been mended twice, pages thinned from years of turning. He didn't often read it aloud. Most times he kept its words to himself, but the room felt like it could hold something softer than the wind outside. He settled into the rocker, angled toward the hearth, and let the chair find its rhythm. "If any man be in Christ, unhurried, as if they'd been waiting in the quiet. If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. 2 Corinthians 5:17. The verse sat in the air a moment, not pressed toward her, not explained. Elena's needle kept its steady path, but her eyes flicked up once, just enough to meet his before returning to the thread. Mika stirred, sighed, and slipped back into sleep. Caleb closed the Bible and set it on the small table beside the rocker. He didn't speak further, and the silence that followed felt different, not the wary kind, but the kind that comes when two people are listening to the same thing without saying so. The afternoon passed in small work. He split wood behind the barn. She washed the dress in river water, cold enough to bite the skin. At the edge of the bank, she hummed again, that same Dine melody he'd heard in the first weeks, the notes carrying across the slow bend of the Pecos. From where he repaired the shed roof, the sound reached him like a line cast between them. When she came back inside, the dress hung over one arm, damp and smelling faintly of river and soap root. She draped it near the fire without asking, as if she'd decided the cabin could hold more of her life. Evening settled in early. The hills drew their shadows long, and the wind began its restless push at the walls. Caleb ladled beans into 2 bowls, set them on the table, and poured coffee into both cups without looking to see if she'd take hers. She did. After the meal, Mika fussed against the cradle's edge. Elena reached to lift her, but Caleb was closer. He picked the baby up, letting her small weight rest along his forearm. She blinked up at him, dark eyes trying to find the firelight. He adjusted his hold the way a man remembers a thing in his hands after many years, and began to walk the short span between wall and window. Elena watched from her chair, hands stilled in her lap. "She likes the sound of boots on wood," she said quietly. "It makes her calm." He didn't answer, but he kept walking until the baby's breathing evened out. When he set her back down, the rocker's old creak seemed less like a ghost and more like a lullaby. The lamp burned low before they moved again. Caleb banked the fire, the embers settling with a faint hiss. Elena rose to add another quilt over Micah, then paused by the table. Her hand brushed the Bible's cover. She didn't open it, but her fingers lingered there as if testing its weight. Outside, frost was forming again, tracing the porch boards in silver. Inside, the quiet felt fuller than before. The days shortened, and the mornings came cold enough to turn the pump handle stiff. Caleb kept the fire banked high in the early hours, the cabin walls holding on to its heat like a secret. One morning, after feeding the horses, he stayed in the barn instead of returning straight inside. On the workbench sat a block of cedar he'd kept for years, once meant for a saddle horn, never finished. He turned it in his hands, running a thumb over the grain. The wood had a warm scent, sharper than pine, and a reddish glow that caught the light from the high window. He began to carve, slow and steady. Not with the practiced efficiency of a man making something for sale, but with the care of someone letting his hands think before his mind spoke. The shape came gradual, a curve meant to fit the palm, teeth spaced to slide through hair without pulling. By midday, fine curls of cedar covered the bench. He sanded each edge smooth, then set the finished comb in his hand, weighing it as if to be sure it belonged there. Without wrapping it, without ceremony, he walked back to the house. Elena was by the hearth, brushing out her braid. The firelight caught the strands as they fell over her shoulder, black and heavy, the red cloth tie resting against her collarbone. She paused when she saw him. He opened his palm. The comb lay there, simple, curved, the cedar's scent still fresh. Her eyes moved from the comb to his face, and for a moment something unreadable passed between them. She stood, stepped closer, and took it without a word. Turning, she walked to the mantel where Ruth's old mirror leaned against the wall. Its frame was chipped at the corners, the glass silvered unevenly from years of heat and smoke. Elena placed the comb beside it, deliberately, as if adding one piece to another without replacing what was already there. Past and present in the same line of sight. Caleb didn't move closer, but his chest tightened in a way that felt like both loss and gain at once. She glanced over her shoulder. "Cedar keeps its warmth," she said. "That's the hope," he replied. The rest of the day passed in quiet work. She used the comb that evening, drawing it through her hair in slow strokes as Mika slept. Each pass carried the cedar's faint sweetness into the room. Caleb pretended not to notice, though every motion seemed to pull the air tighter around them. When the lamp was turned down low, she set the comb back on the mantel. This time, her fingers lingered there a moment longer, tracing the wood's curve before letting it go. Later, as the wind rattled the porch boards, Caleb sat in the rocker and listened to the soft rhythm of her braid sliding through the comb's teeth. It was a sound that seemed to settle the room, like the crackle of the fire or the sigh of the stove. By the time he banked the fire for the night, the comb still sat in its place beside the mirror, holding its place as if it had always been meant to be there. The trip to Dry Bluff was meant to be ordinary. Feed for the horses, a length of rope, lamp oil before winter closed its grip. Caleb hitched the wagon just after dawn, the frost still clinging to the grass in the shadowed parts of the yard. Elena stayed behind with Mika, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. The road wound south through dry country, the Pecos never far from sight. By mid-morning, the flat-roofed buildings of Dry Bluff rose out of the dust. Caleb guided the wagon past the mercantile and stopped at the small clapboard office where the county clerk kept his records. Inside, the air smelled of paper and lamp oil. The clerk was a narrow man with a thin mustache and a habit of clearing his throat before every word. Caleb set his hat on the counter and asked for a form, common law declaration. The clerk hesitated, then slid the paper forward. "Not many file these," he said. Caleb took the stub of a pencil and wrote in the names, Caleb Hart and Elena Hart. Date of union, left blank, then filled with the day she'd first stepped into his cabin. He signed, then pressed the pad of his thumb into the ink and stamped it beside his name. The clerk blotted the paper, folded it once, and slid it into an envelope. "You want this on file?" "No, I'll keep it." By the time he returned to the wagon, the envelope was tucked inside the old coffee tin beneath the seat, same tin that held Ruth's ring and ribbon. He didn't plan to show it to Elena, not yet. It wasn't about words or ceremony. It was about building a net strong enough to hold when the wind came hard. On the way back, he stopped at the mercantile for the rest of his list. That's where Asby Pike saw him. Pike was a trader who knew too much about other people's business and sold that knowledge as quick as he sold whiskey. "You been keepin' company, Hart?" Pike asked, leaning against a barrel of flour. His grin was a thin blade. Caleb didn't answer, just loaded the rope and oil into the wagon bed. Pike squinted. "Saw a woman washing at the river a few days back. Not from around here. Pretty thing. Native." His tone carried more curiosity than malice, but it was the kind of curiosity that spread. Caleb stepped close enough that Pike had to straighten. "You talk too much." Pike held up both hands, but the smirk didn't leave his face. "Just making conversation." The conversation followed him back to the saloon that night, and from there it traveled in faster ways than horses could run. By the week's end, the name reached Silas Cray. Back at the ranch, Elena noticed the way Caleb kept looking toward the road that evening. She didn't ask. The light was fading, and Mika was fussing for her feed. Caleb sat at the table, turning his coffee cup in slow circles. the sound of ceramic on wood just loud enough to fill the space where words might have gone. When Elena set the baby down for the night, she found him on the porch, arms resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The air was still, but it felt like the land was holding its breath. The wind began before the clouds. It came low over the hills, carrying the smell of rain not yet fallen. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the color of tarnished silver, and the cottonwoods bent under the steady push. Caleb stood in the yard, hat pulled low, scanning the horizon. The air felt tight, charged. He called to Elena, who was sorting clothes in the doorway. "Storm's coming in fast." She nodded and turned back inside, gathering the baby's things into a basket. The thick blanket, 2 changes of swaddling, the small carved rattle Caleb had whittled in the evenings. Out by the barn, he worked quickly, latching the stable doors, tying down the feed sacks, checking each length of rope twice. The horses shifted nervously, their hooves striking the packed dirt in uneven rhythm. The first drops came hard, scattered, each one darkening the dust where it struck. Then the rain swept in all at once, slanting across the yard like a curtain pulled too quickly. Caleb ducked his head and pushed against the wind toward the cabin. Inside, Elena had the shutters closed and the hearth burning high. Mika lay in her arms, restless, kicking against the blanket. The storm rattled the roof boards, thunder rolling close enough to shake the walls. Caleb pulled off his coat, hung it dripping by the door, and moved toward the hearth. The room smelled of cedar smoke and damp wool. Elena's eyes met his briefly, a question there she didn't speak. The wind howled down the chimney, making the fire hiss. In the noise, they almost didn't hear Mika's small sound, half a whimper, half a reaching breath. Her tiny hand pushed out from the folds of the blanket, fingers opening toward him. Caleb hesitated, then stepped forward. Elena shifted just enough to let him take the child. Mika settled into his arms without protest, her cheek pressing against the rough fabric of his shirt. He rocked her gently, finding the motion without thinking. The chair in the corner waited, its familiar creak long tied to memories he'd rather leave untouched. But tonight it felt different. He lowered himself into it, the weight of the baby in his arms, the fire throwing soft light across the walls. Elena stood nearby, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. She watched them without moving, the set of her jaw loosening as the minutes passed. The storm outside pressed hard against the cabin, but inside, the rhythm of the rocker seemed to hold the space steady. Mika's breathing slowed, her small hand curling around the edge of his thumb. Caleb looked down at her face, the lashes damp from earlier fussing, the skin warm against his chest. For the first time in years, the rocker's motion didn't carry him backward. It held him here. When he finally looked up, Elena was by the hearth, hanging the shawl to dry. Steam rose from the wool, twisting upward like a prayer finding its way into the air. They didn't speak. The fire popped softly, the storm beginning to drift east, its voice fading into the hills. In that quiet, something had shifted. No longer just 2 people sharing a roof against the wind, but 3 souls bound by something they hadn't named yet. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The storm had deepened into something alive. Rain slashed sideways across the yard, rattling the shutters like fists on a locked door. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, and the thunder followed hard, rolling down from the hills as if the land itself were answering back. Caleb stood on the porch, one boot planted on the top step, the other braced behind him. The wind clawed at his coat. Somewhere beyond the rain came another sound. Not the storm, not the restless horses, a second set of hoofbeats, steady and deliberate. They broke through the gray curtain a moment later. Silas Cray, hunched in the saddle, slicker plastered to his shoulders. His horse snorted steam into the cold air, hooves splashing through the mud until Cray reined him in at the foot of the steps. Cray tipped his hat back just enough to show his grin. "Evenin', Hart. I'm here for what's mine." His voice carried easily over the storm, sharpened by the wind. Caleb didn't move. "Nothing here belongs to you. That woman does, and the child. You've got no claim." Cray's tone wasn't heated. It was the calm certainty of a man used to getting his way. Behind Caleb, a faint movement. Elena, standing just inside the doorway, shawl drawn tight around her, Mika pressed close to her chest. Her eyes met his for half a second before she shifted her gaze to the rain-slicked boards at her feet. "You'll turn her over," Cray went on, "or I'll be back with the law, and there'll be no kindness left in it." Caleb stepped down one stair, the wind slapping rain across his face. "You bring whoever you think will stand with you," he said evenly. "No one here is property." For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to pause, the only sound the hiss of rain in the grass. Then Cray's grin thinned. "You'll regret it." He wheeled the horse hard, mud spraying from the hooves. In seconds, the gray wall of rain swallowed him whole again, hoofbeats fading into the thunder's growl. Caleb stayed on the steps until the last echo was gone. Only then did he turn back toward the door. Elena hadn't moved, but something in the way she stood, chin higher, shoulders squared, told him the choice he'd just made was no longer his alone to carry. By dawn, the storm had moved east, leaving the land scrubbed raw and quiet. A pale winter sun edged over the horizon, its light washing the wet boards of the porch in a cold silver sheen. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Inside, Caleb moved slowly, as if each step needed to be placed with care. He set the old Winchester on the table by the hearth, a rifle he hadn't touched in years. The metal bore a soft patina, the stock smoothed by hands long gone. He didn't load it. He didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Elena sat near the window, Mika dozing against her shoulder. She glanced at the rifle, then at Caleb. Her expression was unreadable, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the blanket around the baby and let the silence stretch between them. Caleb poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The sound of the liquid hitting metal was louder than it should have been in the quiet room. He set one cup near her chair without a word, then sat in his own, the rifle resting between them on the table like an unspoken agreement. Minutes passed, the fire crackling softly, the room holding its breath. Outside, a single crow called from the cottonwoods, its voice sharp against the stillness. Elena reached for her cup, her fingers brushing his. Just a moment, just enough for the touch to register before she took the handle. Caleb didn't pull back. "You're expecting him," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "I'd be a fool not to," Caleb replied. No promise passed between them, but neither looked away. Her eyes were dark and clear, carrying a weight that matched his own. Mika stirred, letting out a small sound that drew both their gazes. Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, watching the child's small hand work free from the blanket. Elena shifted her chair slightly closer. Not enough to close the space entirely, but enough to let their knees almost touch. It was not comfort, exactly, more like recognition. Outside, the day was brightening, the frost on the grass beginning to give way under the sun. But inside, the air remained taut, the moment suspended, 2 people bracing for the return of a man who'd promised to come back. The knock came just after midday, 3 firm raps that carried the weight of authority. Caleb set down the fence post he'd been working on and crossed the yard, wiping his hands on his coat. Silas Cray stood at the foot of the porch again, But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him, straight-backed and expressionless, was Deputy Walt Hollis. The deputy's badge caught the pale light, a hard gleam against the worn leather of his vest. In Hollis's hand was a folded sheet of paper, the edges damp from the lingering morning mist. "Afternoon, Hart," Hollis said, his voice even. "Got a complaint here, signed and sworn. Says you're holding a woman against her lawful guardian's will." Cray's grin widened. "And I can take her home today without trouble." Caleb stepped onto the porch. He didn't raise his voice. "You've been told before, Silas, she's not yours. Not by law, not by any decent measure." Cray gestured toward the paper. "Law says otherwise, and the law's standin' right here." Hollis shifted, his gaze moving between them. "You got anything to show that counters this claim?" Caleb nodded once. "I do." He turned, stepped inside, and came back with a worn envelope from the tin box by the hearth. Inside was the common law marriage receipt, signed by the clerk in Dry Bluff, and the deed to his land. He handed them over without ceremony. "This says Elena Begay Hart lives here by choice. And this," he tapped the deed, "says this is my land. On it, she is my wife under the law of this county and under her own will." Hollis read in silence, the only sound the paper's soft rasp under his fingers. Finally, he looked at Cray. "You didn't mention she had papers. That changes things." Cray's jaw tightened. "Paper don't change truth." "Maybe not," Hollis said, "but it changes what I can act on. Far as I'm concerned, she stays if she wants to stay. And I suggest both of you let things lie before it gets worse." Caleb held Cray's gaze, the rain-darkened brim of his hat casting his eyes in shadow. Cray didn't answer, but the set of his mouth promised this wasn't over. He turned his horse without a word, the deputy following at a slower pace. From the doorway, Elena watched them go. Her grip on Mika was steady, but her shoulders eased, just a fraction, as the hoofbeats faded down the road. The summons arrived 2 mornings later, tucked into the cracked leather satchel of a boy who rode in from Dry Bluff. He handed it over without meeting Caleb's eyes, mumbled something about the travel in court, and was gone before the kettle on the stove could whistle. Caleb unfolded the paper at the table. The words were stiff and formal. "Appear before Judge Ambrose Whitaker, charged with harboring a person against lawful claim." The date was 3 days off. His thumb pressed into the crease until it left a white mark on the page. Elena was by the hearth, coaxing Mika to drink from a tin cup. She glanced over her shoulder at the paper in his hands. "What is it?" "They want me in town." His voice was flat. "Want me to answer to Cray's claim." Her eyes stayed on him a moment longer than usual, searching. Then she set the cup down, wiped Mika's mouth, and stood. "Then I'll go with you." Caleb shook his head. "It's not your burden to." "It is," she said quietly, but with no hesitation. She crossed the room, stopped just short of him. "He says I am his. If the court must hear it, they will hear it from me." For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the tick of the mantel clock and the faint hiss of wood settling in the stove. Caleb folded the summons, slid it into his coat pocket. "We leave before first light." On the morning of the 3rd day, the frost lay thick across the yard, each blade of grass encased in glassy white. Caleb hitched the wagon, the leather traces creaking in the brittle air. Elena emerged with Mika wrapped in a quilt, her own shawl drawn tight against the cold. She stepped up into the seat beside him without needing his hand, though she kept one arm around the baby and the other hooked in the fold of his coat. The wheels crunched over frozen ground, breath from the horses hanging in the still air. Beyond the river, the road wound toward Dry Bluff, the low sun catching the frost until it flared like sparks. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the next hours wouldn't decide for them. But in the quiet between them, the steady weight of her arm at his side, the warmth of the child pressed close. Caleb felt the resolve settle in. Whatever waited in that town, they would face it together. The courthouse in Dry Bluff was no marble edifice, just a converted hay barn with a potbelly stove in the corner and benches that creaked under the weight of the townsfolk curious enough to watch. The smell of damp wool and coal smoke hung in the air. Judge Ambrose Whitaker sat at a plain desk, his white beard spilling over a warm black coat. He rapped a wooden gavel once, the sound sharp in the close space. "Case of Silas Cray v. Caleb Hart," he said. "Claim of unlawful harboring." Cray went first, hat in hand but voice hard. "She was promised to me. Been living under my care near on 2 years. He took her without right." His gaze slid toward Elena, as if staking his claim in the open. Deputy Hollis gave his account next. The arrival at Caleb's, the papers shown, his decision not to remove Elena. His words were steady, stripped of judgment. Then the judge looked to Caleb. "Your turn, Mr. Hart." Caleb rose. The room felt smaller with every step to the front. "I found her and the child in the river bend, near frozen to death. I brought them in, fed them, kept them safe. She is here by her own choice, not mine." He turned his eyes on Cray. "A person is not property. You can't own a life. You can't call care what's built on fear." The judge shifted his gaze to Elena. "And you, ma'am, what's your wish?" Elena's voice was quiet but carried. "To stay where I am, with my child, with Mr. Hart." Whitaker nodded slowly. "This court," he said, "has no authority to grant ownership of a human being. The complaint is dismissed." His gavel struck the desk. "You're both free to go." A murmur rolled through the benches. Cray's jaw worked, but he said nothing as he turned on his heel and stalked out into the cold. Outside, the air was bright and sharp. Caleb waited until they were clear of the door, then exhaled, the breath fogging between them. He looked down at the frost-mapped street, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "Learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow." Isaiah 1:17. Elena's hand found the edge of his sleeve. It wasn't a grasp, just a touch, enough to let him know she'd heard. The road home was quieter than either of them expected. The wheels rolled over hard-packed earth, the creak of the wagon blending with the muffled snort of the horses. Overhead, the sky had shifted to a soft pewter, clouds hanging low as if the land were holding its breath. Elena sat with Mika bundled against her, the child's tiny hand tucked under her chin. Caleb kept both hands on the reins, eyes scanning the road ahead. Neither spoke, but the silence carried no tension now, only the slow unwinding of a knot they'd both carried for weeks. Beyond the cottonwood stand, flakes began to fall. Thin, hesitant at first, then steadier, melting on the rough wool of Caleb's coat before they could cling. He glanced sideways. Elena was watching the snow with the faintest curve to her mouth, as though the sight was a small mercy she hadn't expected. The horses slowed as they crossed the shallow bend of the river, hooves breaking thin crusts of ice along the edges. Caleb remembered the night he'd found them there, the weight in Elena's arms, the pallor of her face, the way the current had seemed determined to pull them away. The memory felt distant now, softened by the knowledge of what had followed. As the wagon crested the last rise before the homestead, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from his own chimney. The sight of the cabin, its windows aglow against the gray afternoon, loosened something in his chest he hadn't realized was still clenched. When they pulled up to the porch, Caleb set the brake and stepped down, offering a hand for Mika. Elena passed the child to him without hesitation, her fingers brushing his as she let go. He settled the baby against his shoulder, the small body warm even through the quilt. She climbed down beside him, looking toward the cabin. "I'll stay," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "For how long?" he asked. Her eyes met his. "One more season," she said. "We'll see after that." Caleb nodded, not pressing further. It was enough, more than he'd had any right to expect weeks ago. Together they crossed the yard toward the waiting light of the cabin, the snow closing softly around their footprints. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The wind had picked up by the time they reached the homestead, sending thin sheets of snow skimming across the yard. Caleb stepped down from the wagon first, boots crunching on the packed drifts. He lifted Mika from Elena's arms and held the child close as they crossed to the porch. The quilt smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender, a small comfort against the sting of the air. Inside, the cabin welcomed them with the familiar hush of walls holding back the cold. Caleb set Mika down on the couch and bent to coax the fire in the stove, laying fresh kindling atop the glowing embers. The wood caught quickly, flames licking upward, casting warm gold against the rafters. Elena moved to the corner where the cradle stood. It was no longer the half-forgotten thing of peeling paint and loose joints. Caleb had spent evenings repairing it, sanding down the rails until they were smooth as river stones, replacing the warped baseboard, and rubbing the wood with oil until it glowed. Now it waited, steady, whole, ready. She laid Mika inside, the quilt tucked snugly around him. For a long moment she simply rested a hand on the child's chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. The fire popped, and somewhere outside the wind rattled the eaves. Caleb straightened from the stove, wiping his hands on a rag. He stepped to the mantel, took down the small hunting knife with the worn antler handle, and crossed to the far wall. There, on the heavy beam above the cradle, the names were carved. Ruth Hart, his wife, gone all these years. The letters were darkened by time, the edges softened by touch. He set the knife's tip against the wood just below that name. Slowly, with steady pressure, he began to carve. Mika Hart. The letters took shape in the quiet, each curl of wood falling to the floor like pale shavings of bone. When it was done, he stepped back. 2 names, bound by the same grain of timber, past and present sharing the same shelter. Elena had turned to watch him. She didn't speak, but her gaze moved between the names and then settled on him with an expression that held both gratitude and something quieter, harder to name. The knife went back to the mantel. Caleb stood a moment longer, eyes lingering on the beam. The act had not erased Ruth, nor diminished her. Instead, it made room, a place where memory and new life could stand together. Elena returned to the cradle, humming softly. The melody had no words, but it was the same one she'd sung by the river under the cottonwoods. It filled the space between them, weaving through the crackle of the fire and the winter wind beyond the walls. Caleb moved to the window. Snow was falling more heavily now, soft flakes drifting past the glass. The yard was already losing its shapes, smoothing under the gathering white. He touched the sill absently, feeling the faint chill seeping through, and thought of how the seasons had a way of covering old tracks, making the ground ready for something new. By late afternoon, the snow had softened into a steady, gentle fall. The wind eased, leaving only the faint hiss of flakes against the cabin walls. Caleb poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, the steam curling upward in the dim kitchen light. He set one mug on the table, in front of the chair across from his own. Elena glanced at it, then at him, and after a moment sat down. She cupped the mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Outside the small window, the glass had clouded with a thin mist from the stove's warmth. Beyond it, the yard was a blur of white and drifting shadows. The porch roof held a perfect line of snow, unbroken, like the first clean page in a ledger. Caleb took a slow sip, letting the bitter, familiar taste anchor him in the present. He thought of the years he'd spent drinking coffee alone, the other mug packed away in a cupboard because there was no one to drink from it. Now 2 cups sat between them, their steam mingling in the air. On the far wall, above the cradle, the names waited in quiet witness: Ruth Hart and Micah Hart. The fire in the stove glinted off the fresh cuts in the wood, catching each curve and line. His eyes drifted to the mantel, where Ruth's photograph rested in its tin frame. Her smile was small, the kind that didn't fade easily. In the hush, he heard her voice from years ago. Not in grief, not in memory's distortion, but as if she were standing just behind him, warm and steady. It was something she'd told him once, when they were younger and the world seemed clearer. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these 3. But the greatest of these is charity. 1 Corinthians 13:13. The words settled in his chest, not as a command, but as a truth that had carried him here, through the snow, through the losses, into this room where a new life was breathing softly in the corner. Elena followed his gaze to the photograph. She didn't ask, but something in her eyes said she understood enough. She set her mug down and rose, moving to the window. Her fingers brushed the glass, leaving a faint streak in the condensation. "Still falling," she said. "Likely will all night," Caleb replied. They stood a moment longer in the shared quiet, then returned to their seats. The coffee had cooled slightly, but neither seemed to mind. Outside, the snow kept its patient work, layering the land in white. Inside, the fire hummed in the stove, the scent of coffee and cedar smoke wrapping the room in a kind of fragile peace. It was not a victory parade, nor the sudden lifting of every burden. It was something smaller, and maybe truer. Faith, hope, love. Enough to carry them through another season, and for now, that was all they needed. And as the snow fell beyond the window, perhaps you, too, remember faces, voices, and quiet acts of kindness that shaped your own trail. These are the true Wild West stories, not just of gunfights, but of hearts choosing compassion. If this one has found its way to yours, share it, so the warmth can travel further.